Thank you very much for reminding me that our public lecture as well as discussion here from one of the seminar rooms of the Department of Development Studies will be recorded. So welcome to everybody. It's an absolute pleasure to welcome you here from the seminar room of the Department of Development Studies. And for sure, it's my distinct pleasure to welcome Dr. Tom Pessah from Tel Aviv, who will share his thoughts, his analysis on the Israeli society from a sociological perspective in a few minutes. So thanks really so much for participating and for speaking to us. Thank you. Before I will introduce him further, I would like to say some words on the one hand about the current situation we are confronted with here at the university, and on the other hand, for sure, also to thank the co-organizer of this event, Ramin Tagian. He, I think, is now responsible for the F&A, the Q&A section. He will deal with all the questions you have, all comments you have as well. Ramin is a historian focusing on the wider, I would say, West Asia region, to use another term normally used as Middle East, that includes Iran as well, and the Maghreb. So both Maghreb as well as Iran. And currently he teaches in one of Viennese high schools. So great, thanks really so much for co-organizing everything. Thanks so much for co-sharing this session as well. By the way, my name is Helmut Krieger. I'm a senior scientist as well as a senior lecturer here at the Department of Development Studies. So I'm absolutely pleased to welcome you to our next lecture. Most of you know that this is the fourth one dealing with the war on Gaza. We had a wonderful lecture with Rabab El-Mahdi from the American University in Cairo on the 19th of March this year. Then a great lecture by Francesca Albanese, the UN Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights, as it is formally called, the title, on the situation of human rights in the territories occupied since 1967. For sure, this includes Gaza as well. And we had a wonderful lecture with Rashid Khalidi, that was Said, professor of Arab Studies from Columbia University 2 weeks ago. So you can see, and as I have already mentioned in our previous lectures, we could enforce, and that might sound for some of us quite bizarre, we could enforce public lectures and discussion at the University of Vienna at all. And this leads me to the situation we are confronted with here at the university, because as many of you know, many lectures as well as statements, lectures on the situation in Gaza, on the war on Gaza, were cancelled by the university, ranging from a teaching series end of October, beginning of November last year, to a very wonderful lecture course on Palestine this year, and it should have held in this summer term 2024. These experiences were one of the preconditions we were confronted with when deciding to have public lectures and discussions. And I'm really absolutely happy to see that we could enforce these lectures despite the obstacles by the University of Vienna. And for sure, by doing that, we definitely are the ones who remind everybody of the importance of academic freedom, and to remind everybody of the significance to have an ongoing and differentiated debate on the war in Gaza on campus. on this campus at the University of Vienna, as well as on many other campuses across Western Europe, as well as the US. It's more than significant to have this and to enforce our right to speak. So having said this, I would like to introduce in a few words our speaker tonight, Dr. Tom Pessah, and it's really my pleasure that you accepted our invitation and will speak about a historical, sociological perspective on Israeli society. And for sure, we know for a talk of about 30 to maximum 40 minutes, it is impossible to reconstruct every historic detail of, let's say, a Zionist movement organizationally formed in the late 19th century here in Europe until today's moment, or better to say what Francesca Albanese once mentioned, this genocidal logic in place today, tomorrow, and yesterday in Gaza. So Tom Pessah is a sociologist and received his BA and MA at Tel Aviv University, where he also completed a degree in general history. His PhD, which he completed in 2014 at the University of California, Berkeley, focuses on internal debates regarding ethnic cleansing within settler colonial societies. Thomas had taught on the sociology of ethnicity and violence at the Hebrew University and Ben Gurion University. Furthermore, he is the former chair of the board of Sochrot, an Israeli organization promoting awareness of the Nakba and the right of return. So thanks again so much for speaking to us, and just a few last words about the format. After 30 to 40 minutes, we will open the floor to discussions, but for sure, please use the Q&A section here to raise your questions online. And for sure this time, we will also make sure to include all my students in the classroom here if there are any kind of questions, comments, analyses after Tom's talk. So thanks again so much. And now I would like to hand over to you, Tom.
Well, first of all, I'd like to thank Helmut, you and Ramin for giving me this opportunity. I think because there's a constant feeling of, really in my social circles and people I know, we all feel we're not doing enough. And I don't know what enough would mean in this context, but it's good to have the feeling that I'm actually contributing in a small way to raising awareness of what's happening through this analysis, and maybe trying to generate discussion about some of the background of some of the causes, or how we interpret this genocide in Gaza. And I also want to say I feel humbled speaking after really all the people you mentioned. I hope I won't disappoint you. Okay, so this is my title. I want to. When I was preparing the lecture, I decided to scale down a little bit what I said in my abstract. We have an expression in Hebrew, tafasta merubeh lo tafasta, which means if you try and capture a lot, you'll capture nothing. So there's many different aspects of, as you actually said, Helmut, in your introduction, many aspects of the history of Zionism and the Israeli society and everything, and the current moment. And I'm sort of, I really want to talk about a lot of things, but I didn't want to cram in like one point about everything that interests me or concerns me, but I thought I would try and make it a bit more analytical, and that would be a bit clearer for you as well as listeners. So first of all, I want to start off from saying what we are experiencing now, what we are witnessing now in Gaza is a genocide. I think we need to insist on using that term. Tens of thousands of civilians are being killed. Hundreds of thousands are in danger of starving to death. I can't emphasize that enough. Babies really are starving to death. Dozens of babies have already died. Other babies, if they survive, are going to have defects for the rest of their lives, because when you don't have proper nutrition at this age, that will affect your development for the rest of your life. And this isn't a mistake. This isn't a coincidence. This is systematically withholding food and water from the population in order to cause this to happen. And something that I wasn't aware of, but the Palestinian ambassador to Egypt said that 100,000 have already been displaced to Egypt. So another side effect of what's happening is displacement. If people aren't killed, that is also a massive number. That is a very high percentage of the civilians in Gaza, and also we can also say in the West Bank, ethnic cleansing is accelerating. There's been a lot of, it doesn't get talked about as much, but there have been entire communities cleared out by settler attacks. I think 20 communities at the moment since October 7th. And also from the point of view of rhetoric, I've lived in Israel for most of my life, apart from the time I was in Berkeley, and I have never seen so much genocidal rhetoric. It used to be sort of a fringe thing, and now it's pretty much mainstream. People quite openly say, yes, we want babies to die. You know, and we hear from the government, from other sources, people very openly saying the enemy is the civilians. It's not, they don't try to hide it. So my general question is, how did we get here? Now, obviously there are many causes. I want to, as a sociologist, focus on two things which I think are more structural. That is to say, I'm not going to focus on the personalities. And of course, there is a contribution. Netanyahu's personality, we can say a lot about him. And Sinwar, perhaps you can say something about him. And you can say something about religious fundamentalism, which influenced not only Hamas, but also the current Israeli government. We have two parties which could easily be characterized as fundamentalist, and they are driving policy in a lot of ways. And I think we read a lot about, we don't read enough, but we read somewhat about these things in the media. But I want to focus on two more structural elements, which I think explain a lot of things about Israeli society. And I want to sensitize you, make you more sensitive to these concepts and to their history and to their usefulness. And hopefully they'll help you interpret a lot of what is going on. And finally, I'll round it up by saying something about decolonization as some kind of long-term solution. So basically, I'm not really only talking about Gaza, although Gaza is one variant of what's happening, but it's also what's happening in the West Bank and even what's happening to Palestinian citizens of Israel. And I'm not only talking about Netanyahu, I'm also talking about, for example, the previous government, which was the Bennett and Lapid government. And I'm asking, you know, what do they have in common, and what are the structural elements that we see long-term, and not just the specifics of Netanyahu's personality. And I can expand on other aspects and things that I mentioned in the abstract on the Q&A, so I'm actually looking forward to that. So since you're in Vienna, my first concept is about settler colonialism. I'm going to talk about settler colonialism and militarism. Since you're in Vienna, I wanted to say more than a few words about Herzl. Because I think, not as a sort of, you know, making him the villain or accusing him or something like that of everything to do with Zionism, because, you know, there are a lot of people responsible for Zionism, obviously, not to focus on too much on him personally, but I think it's a good illustration of a lot of long-term tendencies that became institutionalized and are relevant until today. And I'm using this also so as you can make a strong distinction between Zionism and Judaism, because the classic sort of defense of Zionism is to say any criticism of Zionism is anti-Semitism, and we see that is they're trying to codify this in law. I don't know what's the situation in Austria, but I know in the US there's a lot of states where claiming Israel is a racist endeavor, so a racist project, is a form of anti-Semitism according to the law. So we need to really insist on trying to make those distinctions between religious persecution and the legitimate political argument. So, who was Herzl? Herzl was born in Vienna. He was a journalist most of his life. He was very much assimilated. So, just before he became a Zionist, he used to support massive conversion to Christianity. As a solution to the Jewish problem, right? So he thought the Jews have a problem. There's a problem with anti-Semitism, and the solution will be they will stop being Jews. They will, in an honorable way, all go to a church, or the leaders will go to a church and convert to Christianity, and that'll be the end of the Jewish problem. So, which I think is somewhat telling. And he grew up in Vienna during the time when Karl Lueger was mayor, and Karl Lueger was somewhat like Trump today, someone who incited against minorities in order to promote himself politically, just like Trump tries to advance himself by inciting against Muslims, Latinos, Latinas, and so on. So Karl Lueger focused on Jews. So he used he emphasized hatred towards Jews in order and he succeeded in order to get himself promoted politically. So Herzl was very much influenced by that. And of course, the Dreyfus Affair, he was a journalist in France, in Paris, at the time of the Dreyfus Affair. Dreyfus was a Jewish officer in the French army, and he was wrongfully accused of treason, and that brought up a lot of anti-Semitism. So in 1895, Herzl adopts, I should say influence, Herzl adopts a national definition of Jews. He starts seeing Jews as a nation, and really is influenced very much by nationalism in national movements within the Austro-Hungarian Empire, but also by racial concepts of what Jews are. He's actually influenced very much by anti-Semitism, unfortunately. So a lot of his concepts with a twist, but a lot of his concepts of what Jews are, thinking Jews are separate, thinking Jews don't belong in Europe, thinking that their character is bad, as we'll see in a minute, there's something bad about Jews' character. A lot of that is the influence of the anti-Semitism of the time. In 1894, he wrote a play called The New Ghetto, and it's about a Jew who reestablishes his honor by fighting a duel. He dies after fighting a duel, and that way he reestablishes his honor, which he doesn't have. He doesn't originally have this honor because he is a Jew, right? So there's some assumption that there's something sort of dishonorable, shameful about being Jewish, and you need to do something to overcome that. I'm drawing a lot on Daniel Boyarin. He's got a book called Unheroic Conduct, which has a very good chapter on Herzl and the thinking at the time, and masculinity, the role of masculinity, how we view masculinity. So Herzl said in the letter, Jews are harmless, contemptible human beings, lacking in honor, see the theme of honor, and thus bent on profit, become crafty, through prolonged oppression. So you see here the anti-Semitic stereotype of Jews being bent on profit, crafty, all these things that Jews were accused of, through prolonged oppression. So the twist is, he doesn't say this is a natural sort of inevitable quality. He says this is because of where they are. They are in Europe. They've suffered from oppression in Europe, therefore they have to leave. It has corrupted their character. They can no longer live in Europe. And therefore, colonialism is going to be the redemption. Colonialism is going to be the alternative. They're going to and I'm not using colonialism just as my term, but as you see, it's his term. So he very much saw himself as a colonialist, and he saw colonials as these very sort of honorable, manly sort of figures. And he thought, if Jews play the same role, the Gentile Europeans will grow to respect them. So they're reestablishing Jewish masculinity and honor outside of Europe. At the same time, Nodau also became a prominent figure in the Zionist movement, talked about muscular Judaism, right? The Judaism of muscle. So again, this concept that instead of there was a stereotype of the effeminate Jewish male who had a period and all sorts of myths like that about Jewish men. So instead of that, Jews need to grow muscles. The Jewish State, which is his first proper Zionist work, offers a practical plan for the colonization of Palestine or Argentine by a Jewish company with the support of a foreign power. So he looks around, he's trying to think of a way for Jews to leave Europe in an organized way. And his model is, for example, the East India Company. There's a similar company that colonized South Africa. He's thinking his blueprint is colonial companies which have sort of semi-states. The East India Company had had an army. It collected taxes in India. It had a sort of semi-state status, but it was also in the end subservient to the British Queen. So it also produced revenue for Britain, which is why Britain could, up to a point, Britain benefited from it until they cancelled it. We won't go into that. So he's offering this project, which will produce revenue, but also get Jews out of Europe, to foreign powers. As we'll see, he needs foreign powers because he's thinking very much of the reaction of the natives of each colonial target to his settlement projects. So he negotiates with Turkey, with the Ottoman Empire, that is to say, with Germany, with Russia, and with Britain. and he tries to sell Zionism to each one. And in fact, when after his death, Weizmann received the Balfour Declaration from Britain about a decade after Herzl's death, that was in the same spirit of getting the license to colonize Palestine from a European nation, as if a European nation could just give out permission to colonize countries which are, of course, not owned by the Europeans and without the consent of the local population. So it's really a continuation of the same thinking. He also says, he tries to say, why it's like considering why Palestine, why Argentine. These two places have already been, they've already set up specific Jewish colonies in each one of these countries. And he says, Zionist colonies, this is to say, and he says, Palestine is easier to sell to the Jewish masses. Sorry, he says, this is my word. He said, my explanation is, he says, Palestine is easier to sell to Jewish masses whom he hopes to convert to Zionism. So keep in mind, until at least World War II, and probably a few decades after, there's not a majority of Jews in the world who support Zionism, certainly not when Herzl begins. So the majority of Jews in the world either don't know or oppose Zionism. There was a strong religious opposition to Zionism, which we won't get into, but people saw it as something against very fundamental principles in Judaism. So, and he, of course, is very assimilated. He's not religious in any way, as we said. So he says, Palestine is an ever memorable historical home. The very name of Palestine will attract our people with a force of marvelous potency. So he has fundamentally a colonial project. It is not so important where it is, but it could be in Palestine because that would be attractive. He's actually appropriating the image of Palestine in Judaism. In Judaism, yes, there is a theme of return to Palestine when the Messiah comes. So there's this sort of religious myth, belief that one day the Messiah will come and all the Jews, he will lead all the Jews to return to Palestine. And Herzl is appropriating that for his colonial project. He's not saying, let's wait for the Messiah. He's saying, let's now. In other words, we are replacing the Messiah, and we're going to do that now through, accomplish this return now through colonial means. Previous colonization efforts. This is what he has to say. Two territories come under consideration, Palestine and Argentine. In both countries, important experiments in colonization have been made. They've set up what they called colonies in both countries, though on the mistaken principle of a gradual infiltration of Jews. Like Jews went there without official permission, just setting up one colony at a time. Why is that a problem? And infiltration is bound to end badly. It continues until the inevitable moment when the native population feels itself threatened and forces the government to stop a further influx of Jews. Immigration is consequently futile unless we have the sovereign right to continue such immigration. So Herzl says in advance, I see myself as the colonial side. We have the natives, and the natives from their point of view, and he's very realistic about that, very honest at this point. He says the natives will oppose. He's not saying the natives will oppose an influx of Jews because they are anti-Semitic. He's saying they will oppose an influx of Jews because they will become a minority, because they will no longer, the native population will no longer control their own country, which is very reasonable up to a point. But he doesn't say, therefore, I will respect their wishes. He says, no, therefore, I want the sovereign right to continue such immigration. In other words, I want permission from, as we said, Britain, the Ottoman Empire, or some kind of European power. So this is how it's all set up from the beginning. In his diary, he said we must expropriate gently the private property on the state assigned to us. We should try and spirit the penniless population across the border. So there'll be classes within the native population. There's the majority who are poor, and we'll try and encourage them to leave. So from the very beginning, he's thinking of Jewish settlement, Zionist settlement in the colony that he wants to set up as replacing the local population. We will be instead of them. They need to leave. And we'll accomplish that, he says, through economic means. We'll make employment for them in other countries, in the transit country, while denying employment in our own country. So we'll make it difficult for them to receive employment. The property owners, the native property owners, will come over to our side. Why? Both the process of expropriation and removal of the poor must be carried out discreetly. So we realize we need to do this quietly. We don't want to arouse too much opposition. Let the owners of the immovable property believe that they are cheating us, selling us things for more than they are worth, but we are not going to sell anything back. Right? So we're going to buy land from them, buy it at inflated prices, pay them, bribe them basically, these landowners, and we're not going to sell them anything back. We're going to keep it in our hands afterwards. It will be within the market. We'll use the market mechanism of buying land, but afterwards we'll take the land out of the market. This is says in 1895 in his diary. And one final quote, which I think I couldn't resist. This is Cecil Rhodes. Cecil Rhodes is one of the primary colonists of the period. This is a caricature of him ruling over all of Africa because he had investments in diamonds in South Africa and in Egypt and so on. So he was a very sort of dramatic figure in the period, and Herzl admired him. And he wrote to Cecil Rhodes, according to his diary, you're being invited to make history. This cannot frighten you, nor will you laugh at it. It is not in your custom line. It doesn't involve Africa, but a piece of Asia Minor, that is to say Palestine, not Englishmen, but Jews. But had this been on your path, you would have done it by now. How then do I happen to turn to you? How, since this is an out of the way matter for you, how indeed, because it is something colonial. Okay, so Herzl, when he writes this, he says the most important feature of the project I am advancing now is that it is something colonial. So when you hear, accusations of colonialism or something sort of made up now, we're cut off, we don't really know, we're ignorant and so on, this is from the very beginning. This is from Herzl's diary from the very beginning, from 1902, more than 100 years ago. The entire project was considered a form of colonialism. And the point about Herzl is he didn't just write, but he thought very much in organizational terms. So all these ideas are implemented very quickly in an institutional form. He establishes the World Zionist Organization, which says Zionism seeks to establish a home for the Jewish people in Eretz Israel, Palestine, secured under public law, which means, again, this sort of European legal permission. And in 1901, the Jewish National Fund is established, which is also affiliated with all these organizations. And according to Shafir, Israeli sociologist, it was based on the model of Prussian colonization of Poland. The Prussians colonized Poland, but they were afraid the Poles would buy back the land and actually decrease the scope of Prussian colonization. And they devised this method of keeping the land in Prussian hands. What would they do? They would buy land. See if this reminds you of what I just told you about Herzl. They would buy land off the Polish peasants, and then it would become the collective property of the Prussian state, and it could not be sold back. It could only be leased to Prussian farmers, but it could not be sold back to anyone, including Poles. And that is exactly the model of the Jewish National Fund. It is owned, the Jewish National Fund is only, it mentions in its charter that the land belongs to the Jewish people. So it's not the specific Jews living in the land of Israel, in Israel and Palestine. It is all of the Jewish people, and the land belongs to them once it's bought, and it's then leased to Jewish individuals or Jewish groups. They buy it from Palestinians, or they attempt to buy it from Palestinians, and it goes into their hands, and it stays in their hands. And the point is, the Jewish National Funds still exist today, and its charter still exists, and the land situation in Israel is very much determined by that. The original plan to buy land from Palestinians was very, very partially successful. So in 1948, only 7% of land was actually bought. But during 1948, Israel captured much of the land and then appropriated it, not all of it immediately, but gradually, and also from refugees, but also from residents, people who remained in Palestine, and that still continues today. Okay, so even today, as we speak, Israel is busy appropriating land. The government is busy appropriating land, for example, from Bedouins in the Negev, in the Nakab. That is to say, within the Green Line. And of course, no, as I'm sure you are aware, settlements are over time now appropriating land from Palestinians. They just issued a decree that said Palestinians can't be too close to the borders of a settlement, which is amazing because the settlements are obviously trying to get closer and closer to them. So they have to get further and further and further away. But what I'm saying is not just about the West Bank. I'm also talking about within Israel itself. This is the land situation. The Israel Land Authority and the JNF own more than 80% of the land. I think it's over 90% of the land. And they run it according to the same principles. The access to land, they own the land, and they lease it primarily to Jews. And the way that's accomplished is, for example, in any kind of communal settlement. Most of the country is rural, although we have very big cities like, for us, big cities like Tel Aviv or Jerusalem, but most of the land is still held by small rural communities, and those small rural communities, such as kibbutzim, moshavim, mitzpim, and settlements in the West Bank, they can have admissions committees. And the admissions committee is legally allowed since 2011 to reject applicants for their social suitability. Now, that could mean anything. And the official explanation is, if we have a community of vegans, we don't want any carnivores, which sounds great. But in reality, it doesn't mean vegans and carnivores, it means Arabs, right? So it means Palestinians. It means that most of these communal settlements don't have any Palestinians, and they can continue to control the land leased to them by the Israel Land Authority. So basically, what I'm trying to say in short is, in most of the country, Palestinians aren't allowed to live. This is the current situation. Not only that, it's not only in relation to Israelis, it's in relation to Jews, because if, for example, my cousin were to immigrate tomorrow from the UK, he lives in London, he were to immigrate tomorrow from the UK to Israel, he would have the right to live in anywhere, for example, in the Negev, in any one of these communities in the south of the country. A Bedouin Palestinian who's lived there for centuries, his families lived there for centuries, would not have that right. So exclusive Jewish settlement is a continuous tradition. Exclusive in the sense that it is excluding Palestinians, is a continuous tradition from the 1880s in Herzl's writing, but also on the ground. We have petitions from Bedouins writing to the Ottomans, complaining that they're being driven off their land in the 1880s, through the Ottoman and British periods, in the occupied territories after 67, and as I said, within the Green Line. As a term, the term settler colonialism in the wider context originates in the 1960s. There were Fieldhouse and Fredrickson talked about settler colonialism. During the period of decolonization, people were talking about different types of colonialism, the differences between different types. So it started then. A lot of Palestinian and Arab scholars started applying that to Zionism in the 1960s. Some Western scholars, Maxime Rodinson, and today more recently Patrick Wolf, was an Australian, very important Australian scholar who made comparative studies of different kinds of settler colonialism, and Israeli sociologists and geographers. So Israeli sociologists and geographers, I wouldn't say it's the mainstream, but it is an acceptable term within. We have had sessions on settler colonialism within meetings with the Israeli Sociological Association, for example. I recommend Arish Sabar-Khouri's 2021 article about settler colonialism. It's very, very, very comprehensive. It gives you the whole scholarly debate and the history and raises very important questions. I can't summarize it all now, but check it out. So I want to give like a succinct definition, which I developed in my doctorate, which is settler colonialism is characterized by a large immigrant population intent on making the territory their permanent home, and B, the formalization of this population's economic and political privileges in relation to all the indigenous population. So if you just have immigrants going from one place to another, that is, a global phenomenon. There's nothing unusual about that. But if you say we deserve, you try and accomplish more rights than the people already living there, that makes it a form of settler colonialism. And when I say indigenous population, I just mean the existing population prior to the settler invasion, quote unquote, prior to the immigration, you could say. So the issue is not, how pure they are, if they've been there for 100 years or 50 years or 1,000 years, or if their blood, what is in their DNA. The point is they were there when the settlers got there, and the settlers put them in an inferior legal situation in relation to them. So the majority of Jews today are the descendants of immigrants who have privileges in relation to the indigenous population. There was a Jewish population in Palestine prior to Zionism, so it's not the Jews' presence is inherently colonial, but Jewish privileges are. So when we talk about settler colonialism, we'll get in a minute to dismantling settler colonialism. What I'm talking about is these privileges, for example, the access to land. That's a very fundamental thing for Palestinians, the fact that they don't have access to most of the land in Palestine. So dismantling settler colonialism will be that. Dismantling settler colonialism doesn't have to be about driving out all of the Jews and deciding Palestine only belongs to Muslims and Christians. That isn't necessarily decolonization in this sense, in the sense that I outlined. Okay, take a deep breath. I'll give you like a few seconds just to
That's absolutely great. A wonderful intervention. 1 minute break.
Yeah, I just feel like on Zoom you need you can't have too much. I get exhausted with Zoom.
It's absolutely wonderful to summarize a huge and a quite important debate on the term on the one hand, settler colonialism, and for sure on the other hand, some historic pictures of what settler colonialism means in the late 19th century. And for sure, I mean, it's absolutely wonderful to have this kind of reference to Vienna, to Herzl, to Luega, and all the other prominent figures at that time.
Great, thank you. Thank you. Well, I hope I also, yeah, I did something to you. I'm sure you've discussed it in depth. Okay, the second concept I'm going to try and get through a little bit faster is Israeli militarism. So, as we said, the exclusive Zionist settlement or it leads to, or we're going to talk about, it leads to the displacement of Palestinian farmers. The more you say we want this area specifically for Jewish settlement, the more you displace Palestinian farmers. And eventually, starting from the 1920s, that starts to happen in cities as well. We have the concept of Hebrew labor, which means we'll make sure that the places of work only belong to Jews, and that also limits, and also we talk about buying only Hebrew products. And that also can impoverish or limit or exclude Palestinian workers and Palestinian merchants in towns. And there is also like a massive waves of immigration, especially in the 1930s, where Jews become almost a third of the population. And that threatens to turn the indigenous population into a minority in their own homeland. So in relation to all of that, we have waves of Palestinian resistance, and there's a huge range of forms of Palestinian resistance, like petitions and protests, and all sorts of alternative forms, like during the Arab Revolt, there's all sorts of alternatives to the government. It's a sort of anarchist experiment where people set up their own law courts, and there's the whole range of things. But there are also several waves of armed resistance. One of the ways people think they're going to resist is to actually directly use violence. And in 1947, a lot of Palestinians, hundreds of thousands of Palestinians would have been, when the country was partitioned in 1947 by the UN, without the consent of the local indigenous population, which was the majority, a lot of them would have been under part of a Jewish state. And they did not feel like that. From their point of view, they saw most of the Jews as immigrants. They distinguish, by the way, between immigrants and local Jews. There's research about that, between Jews who've been there for centuries and immigrants. But these immigrants, they didn't see as eligible for ruling over them, of having their own state, where these from their experience, they knew they would be second-class citizens because of all what I just said before. So there's resistance to that escalates into clashes and massive displacement of Palestinians, the intervention of armies from neighboring Arab states. 750,000 Palestinians are expelled from the area, and that's the Nakba. And many of them end up in Gaza. Many refugees end up in Gaza. 70% of inhabitants of Gaza until the Current War were refugees originating, or families of refugees originating from 1948. And that also is responsible for a lot of the wars. The refugee situation also creates instability, which leads to a lot of the, especially 56, 67, and 82, what to do with the refugee presence in any which of the neighboring countries, and 73 is because of 67. So it's an ongoing process of armed conflict, which turns the army and army officers into a more and more central institution within Israeli society. It wasn't always the case. So when the original Zionists came, they thought in terms of, they were colonials, but they also talked in national terms. They talked in terms of socialism. They didn't necessarily talk in terms of armed terms, but slowly Zionist and then Israeli society becomes more militaristic. And Ben Eliezer, Israeli sociologist Ben Eliezer, defines militarism as, Uri Ben Eliezer, defines the militarism as the tendency of a society to solve political problems by military means and to legitimize and normalize this approach. So, all societies face political problems, but militarism is the idea, but there's a military solution. The preferable solution, the most obvious solution to every political problem is to use military force. And what I want to say is that you can understand a lot of what is going on now through this militaristic viewpoint, which has become very, very, very entrenched in Israeli society. During 1948, we talk about a nation in arms, Umma b'madim. The idea of the whole nation being recruited as part of the military effort. And that has really continued in a lot of ways since then. So mandatory military service, which started then for most Jewish men and women. There are some exceptions, but that's supposed to be the norm. And it's normalized within the life cycle. So I want you to understand what this means. If we go to, let's say, a card shop in Israel, you'll see cards for the birth, you'll see cards for marriage, you'll see cards for bar mitzvah, which is when Jews are 13 or boys 13, girls are 12. That's like, they become adults from a religious point of view. And for 18, you'll see a card for entering the army. Okay, so that is what you do at 18. Just like you are born when you're born, at 13, if you're a boy, you have a bar mitzvah. At 18, you go to the army. That's part of the normal life cycle. Schools get funding according to how many of their graduates go to combat units. And military service is very much emphasized in schools, and no other, according to research, no other Western nation has so many memorial days. And Daniel Bartalus, the social psychologist, has analyzed those. And you go up from from age 0 every single year, memorializing the soldiers, and the messages, we want you to go in their footsteps. Also be prepared to give your life for the country. Military service is an opportunity for social mobility. So Yagi Levy and Honest also have written about that for women, for Mizrahim, Middle Eastern Jews, for Ethiopian Jews, also for Druze. Well, that's not within the Jewish population. But if you are socially disadvantaged in different ways, it can be an illusion or it can be real, but won't go into that. But that is one more attraction of the army. Civilians go from the army into business, into very prominent business positions, the heads of a very important corporation, into politics. So all the people who are likely to replace Netanyahu himself was in a combat unit, and all the people likely to replace him are people who are coming from the army, who are former chiefs of staff or former very, very senior officers in the army. They go to education, so officers can go straight from the army to run a school, to become principal of a school with no educational background, and to the media. So there are very strong connections between, there's a media, there's an army radio station, and then their graduates go to become journalists in the civilian major on TV, on the radio, and then our media is very much influenced by an army viewpoint. I mean, regardless of censorship, which we also have, but also self-censorship, also identification with the army point of view, with the statements of the army spokesman. The defense industry is very central in the economy, as well as the 9th largest arms exporter in the world. So a lot of people's jobs depend on the army. So if they may have served in the army, or maybe now their company is dealing with the army, and therefore we have a military frame of interpretation. We interpret things in a military way. If we read, for example, 2 days ago, there was a massacre in Rafah. I don't know if you heard, but really a very, very serious massacre. Dozens of civilians have died. People were burnt alive. Intense. How was this reported in Israel? The army struck Hamas leaders, the military operation. The army attacked Hamas leaders who happened to be in this place in Rafah. And that is the way it was reported on the media, and that is what most people believe. Unless you happen to watch Al Jazeera, which we can't now because Al Jazeera is now blocked in Israel. But this is what the society is sort of united around. And this is, I could go into that in the Q&A. This is what happened in 1948. The army united around the society united around the military frame of interpretation. So all these things help you to understand. You could use them as tools. If you want to try and understand a lot of the facts, not everything, not as I said, it won't help you explain religious fundamentalism, but a lot of the basic facts about the genocide, the current genocide. How did 70% of Gaza's population, why were the refugees in the first place? As a result of all these processes of colonialism. How did 100,000 Gazans find themselves on the other side of the border since the war began? Why does that seem to be one of the aims of the war, is to displace them, to make life so hard so to displace people? Again, this form of exclusive settlement replacing Palestinians. Why do people resort so easily to military solutions? When you had the March of Return in 2018, 2019, mostly non-violent, and every weekend Israel shot 2 or 3 people, injured many more. And injured means to say that they kneecapped them. They made them invalids for the handicapped for the rest of their life. This is what preceded October 7th, non-violent, mostly non-violent protests. Why was it so easy to quell that in a military way? Because of militarism, because the military solution, and that was accepted by the Israeli High Court, by the way. The Israeli High Court said it's okay to shoot at unarmed protesters. They're a military threat, and it's fine. So why is the media hardly reporting on the situation? Why is the opposition not saying, you know, we completely disown this war, war is not the solution, we need to, you know, something else? All these things, the opposition is led by officers, as I said. So militarism and colonialism help explain a very, very, very wide range of things. If you're trying to understand Israeli society, I recommend you look more into these two concepts a little more. Okay, even a shorter deep breath. I only have like a couple of slides left, so don't worry.
So that means you're perfectly in time in the sense
Yes,
of...
I want to be in time. I want you to have time for, I don't like when people take up too much space and there's no time for Q&A. So I want to be,
Yeah,
I want to be in time.
that's absolutely great, yeah.
Okay. Okay, let me move on. So the last thing I wanted to say was decolonization. Trying to offer a little bit of hope in this very, very miserable, hopeless situation where we are in now. So like I said, I suggested this definition, which says certain colonialism is characterized by a large immigrant population, which wants to make the territory their home, and the formalization of this population's economic and political privileges. That's what makes them settlers. So decolonization would be to take away these economic and political privileges, not to make them immigrate back, quote unquote, to wherever their ancestors came from, but simply to take away their privileges and make everybody live in equality. For example, dismantling the Jewish National Fund, making land accessible to everybody living in Israel, to Palestinians as well, to make it equally accessible to everyone. Whether we have a one-state solution or two-state solution, the most important thing is to dismantle these structures of inequality in both states, or if they're two states, in both states, if there's one state, all over the place. So I think people get too hung up on this idea of one state or two states, but they don't actually ask, what will be the institutional arrangements. The Haifa Vision documents, which there's an organization called the Higher Follow-up Committee, which represents, it's the representative body of Palestinian citizens of Israel, and they drew up documents in 2014 about the future vision, which is basically documents of decolonization. They say, you know, in the future, education will look like this, and you know, the state symbols will look like that, and housing will look like this, and so on and so on and so on, and trying to imagine what it would be like without the current fortification of Jewish privileges. And then Mohana, Palestinian sociologist, talks about reconciliation and transitional justice, like a truth and reconciliation committee or something of the sort, like they had in South Africa, which will be changing he talks about it from a psychological perspective of creating narratives which are more encompassing, because today we have narratives which are Jewish-centered for Israelis. One of the major features of colonization has been displacement, and therefore return needs to be part of the vision, which means the return of Palestinians who were refugees, who became refugees, who went to other countries. They have the right to live in Palestine, which is where they came from. Most of the land where they came from is still rural land. This is from a study by Palestinian geographer Saman Abu Sita from 1999, but the heads of Palestinian refugee organization confirm that is still the case according to their claims. So it doesn't mean the actual displacement of Israelis. And there is a document called the Cape Town document by Zochrot, which is the organization I used to be in, and Badil, which is an organization that I'm still in Zochrot, but I used to be the chair of the board of Zochrot, and Badil, which is an organization that represents refugees, which outlines how you could reach agreements between refugees and current residents, even in the cases where you have Israelis living in Palestinian houses, all sorts of ways of mediation, leasing, and all sorts of compromises that could be made in order to enable refugees to return. But before we can decolonize, we have to end the genocide. So I tried to offer some kind of, you know, sweet future vision. But before we think of the future vision, we all need to be thinking at the current time, how can we stop what is happening now, which is horrible for everyone. It's horrible for Israelis as well, but it's definitely a genocide for Palestinians. Okay, 41 minutes.
Yes, thank you really so much, Tom.
Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely great. This kind of tour de force from Theodor Herzl to some outlines of what can be decolonization include in the current situation, or better to say, in a future after this genocidal logic as well as the genocidal warfare currently in Gaza. So thank you really so much, Tom. And I think it's really time to include, if you have any kind of questions or comments, to include my classroom as well. I'm not sure if there are already a lot of Q&A. Quite interesting. We don't have now questions in our Q&A section. So to all of you listening to our public lecture, if you are interested in raising different questions, and I think there are a lot of different issues that can be raised, given the very broad historical as well as sociological perspective Tom has, please use the Q&A section. So there is a question from one of my students. Yeah, I think it's not bad. Otherwise, we would have a quite bad quality. But you can use here.
I can go there. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Should I? Yeah. Hello, first of all, and thank you so much for your very insightful words. My question would be, well, you already introduced very well how Zionism in Herzl's time especially was a colonial project in essence. And as we all know, within Western, well, discourse, it's very much like a niche opinion that Zionism and Israel could be part of a settler colonial project. So my question would be, how's the situation in Israel? Do people conceive of Zionism and of Israel as a colonial project right now? And if so, like, who does that and why or why not? Yeah.
No, they do not. Well, some sociologists do. As I said, we had a session in the Israeli Sociological Association about Zionism and settler colonialism, but it's definitely not a widespread opinion. The interesting thing is that a lot of it is an issue of language. So the original Zionist institutions actually used the word colonial. They had a colonial fund. They used the word colonial as part of the name of the institution. And then that got translated into Hebrew. And the translation was hitiyashvut, which means settling. And people are very proud to talk about settling. Everyone uses that term. The settlers use that term. That's a very, very mainstream, and people use it proudly. And no one is aware of the fact that it actually originated as a translation of the word colonization. So colonization is bad, but saying settling and settlements and that kind of thing is fine. So people are really using the same term, but the term colonization has been, and even when they translate Herzl, they don't translate the actual uses in German, the name, the word, I think Colonialism or something like that. I don't, you correct me, your German is better than mine, but they won't say colonialism in Hebrew, though the word colonialism in Hebrew exists, but they would say hitiyashvut to make it sort of more acceptable, and which means settlements, which is more sort of popular. So we're sort of divided by language from the original sources of the word. But of course, people will say, no, we're not colonialists because we're tied to the land, and Jews have always been here, and so on and so on. But which is true, Jews have been there, but the form of settlement was not the same as it is now. So yeah, that's not the common. I'm deliberately giving you this analysis because it is not the common one. This is not the common way the people speak.
Thank you really so much for the question as well as for your answer. Are there some more questions from my students here? Yes, please, another one. I think it's fine. Tom can hear you. Yeah.
So also thanks for your talk. My question concerns what you've mentioned earlier about the sort of continued ongoing, militarization of Israeli society, and sort of the military playing a substantial role in the society, and how that also relates to the settler colonialism project at large. And so my question would be, do you see sort of the demilitarization of Israeli society as a precondition for decolonization, and what would be possibly a perspective for such a process. I know that's quite a hard, a very broad sort of question, but yeah.
Yeah, I think so. I think we can't really imagine decolonization without, at the moment, as I said, the preferred solution for every problem is the military solution. If we just use a little bit more military force, I mean, for example, the way to think about Hamas is, there's a limited number of people, and if we kill all of them, we're finished with Hamas. And during the killing of all of them, they're killing a lot of innocent people, and then people eventually will want to, avenge or resist what has happened, and that's just going to escalate things further. So I can't really see a fundamental change of course without some kind of demilitarization, without changing this sort of military frame of thinking and thinking in terms of political solutions for political problems, and thinking in terms, of course, of compromise, reconciliation, all things I thought of before. But this is a completely different direction. So you would need some kind of demilitarization, I think, yes. There are some organizations promoting that. There are some organizations who encourage refusal. There's an organization called Profil Hadash, which encourages demilitarization of Israeli society, but they're not hugely popular.
Thank you. I mean, this leads me to the question, I think you raised it in your abstract about the different political factions within Israeli society, within the political landscape in Israel, and also connecting it to the first question raised. How about the different political forces? What is your analysis, let's say, before Oslo, post-Oslo, and the current genocidal moment? How do you understand the different political forces on the one hand? And secondly, do you see any kind of political initiative or, in a more organized form, political parties within Israeli political landscape who would follow a path of decolonization and demilitarization?
Okay, so wait, I want to write that down because that was a long question.
Yeah,
so
an answer for the next 2 hours. I know, sorry.
Okay, so during the 1980s and the 1990s, there was what was called the right and left bloc within Israel. The division was the Labour Party, which was the original party that established Israel, and all the social classes and social groups affiliated with it, and the Likud, which was the like a more sort of presented itself as a more sort of nationalist party, which is of course Netanyahu's party until today. The division between them was also social, because the Labour Party, when it was in power, a lot of people were disadvantaged. A lot of Mizrahim, for example, were disadvantaged. They suffered very much under Labour. Children of their families were kidnapped and given off for adoption without their consent. People were screened with radiation, and tens of thousands of people died of cancer. There's also situations Mizrahim have been, they were prevented from reaching work. And there's also ways in which Mizrahi immigrants suffered under the labor movement when they were in control in the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s. And then they all went and voted for the Likud, which was the alternative. But it's not that they were necessarily so right-wing to begin with, but they fell into the trap, you could say, of this right-wing elite, which became the other opposition. So really, the struggle between these two groups in the 80s and 90s, a lot of it was a social struggle. It wasn't so ideological. But in order to sort of justify why it should return to power, the Labour Party became like the champion of Palestinians, and it started saying, actually, no, we're going to make peace, and they represent themselves as very leftist, even though it was the same people had displaced Palestinians both in 1948 and in 1967, and they were generals, and there was Yitzhak Rabin himself during the Intifada was the defense minister, and he gave orders to break the arms and legs of the protesters. They weren't really so leftist in any sense, but they became that became their slogan, and they were influenced to some extent by more radical leftist organizations, and then there were the Oslo Accords. I personally lived through the Oslo Accords, and I thought I was actually the protest where Rabin was assassinated, and I believe very strongly he was just about to make peace, and you know, it was bravely fighting all these people and carrying on and so on. I'm not so sure that really was the, in retrospect, from what we know, it's not so clear that he really intended to set up a Palestinian state. In fact, he took a lot of steps to, for example, a lot of the way Gaza is separated from the West Bank started during Rabin's period. A lot of the way Gaza, and they were institutionalized. Like, for example, we have a population registry. Israel has a population registry of all the people in Gaza. You don't do that if you're just about to end the occupation. You do that if you intend to survey the people for much longer. But still, you know, he did talk about giving more rights to Palestinians. That did create a lot of anger in the right wing. And then there were a lot of terrorist attacks of Hamas in that period. And of course, he ended up being assassinated in 1995. In the 2000s, we had the second Intifada. And one thing that happened over the second Intifada was it led to the Prime Minister at the time, the so-called left-wing Prime Minister at the time, Ehud Barak told people there's no alternative. There's no real alternative. There's no partner. That was his term. There's no partner. And that led to the collapse. All this sort of, which I would say was a bit superficial in the first place, but all this sort of labor movement, which now was supposedly very pro-Palestinian, stopped being pro-Palestinian at that point. And there remain sort of small activist organizations. There's a small, very small portion, tens of thousands of Israelis who vote for, Jewish Israelis who vote for Palestinian-led parties. There's a lot of amazing, brave activists who follow shepherds and try and protect shepherds from settlers. And my friend filmed settlers destroying food to Gaza last week, and they almost killed her. And there's some very brave, wonderful activists, and they're a very, very, very tiny minority. And the people in the Knesset, the so-called left-wing people, parties in the Knesset today, the dividing line isn't the attitude towards Palestinians, because the previous government, the Bennett-Lapid government, also continued the occupation, and they had Meretz, they had Labour, they had all the Zionist leftist parties were part of that government, and they did exactly the same thing towards Palestinians, basically. They didn't start the current genocide, but in terms of continuing occupation, they continued the occupation. The dividing line, why did so many people go out into the streets against Netanyahu last year? Because of all sorts of internal Israeli issues, because of the issue of the strength of the High Court versus the strength of the government. People need an independent High Court for a lot of reasons. For example, LGBTQ rights. The court defends LGBTQ rights. The court gives more. If business people want an independent court, it's better for investment. There's all sorts of other internal Israeli reasons, but not because of Palestinians. The protests of last year had nothing to do with Palestinians. The parliamentary opposition doesn't have any, most of it, apart from as I said, the Arab-led parties. Most of it has no alternative, serious alternative to what Netanyahu is saying. And they're not criticizing the war to such an extent. They are, even though they're supposed to be the opposition, they're not in this case functioning as an opposition. They're not, you don't hear them say, oh, Netanyahu should have ended the war immediately, or it's terrible what Netanyahu did in Gaza, or even it's terrible what Netanyahu is doing to the hostages, because the Israeli hostages are dying in Gaza, and the government is doing very little to release them. Even that not. So I don't have a lot of faith in a strong Israeli, I have a lot of faith in my activist friends, and they're doing a good job, and they're a very small minority. I don't have a lot of faith in any kind of strong Israeli popular movement, parliamentary movement, being pro-Palestine, making a difference. And certainly this situation post October 7th has driven people even more to the right. And as I said, there's rampant, really shocking genocidal rhetoric everywhere. And people who you knew who used to be leftists say things like, you know, yes, I think we should be killing children. I mean, just straight out, with no shame. So I don't think there's a lot of hope of change from within Israeli society. And I don't think there have been a lot of settler colonial societies where settlers just said, oh, you know, we feel bad about our privileges, let's just dismantle the settler colonial society just out of, because they feel sad about it. That's not the way things work. The way things work is people give up privileges when they face some kind of pressure. And that is, I think, you know, your job to some extent as Europeans, or the world, or if this issue is important to you, if the suffering on the ground is important to you, think of how you can create some kind of counter pressure. Because think of all the incentives. Think of the military industry. You know, how many people are profiting from the military industry? They're not just going to give up all this. That's not the way capitalism works. They're not just going to give up all these profits and say, you know, too bad, that harms people. So I think the chances that change will come from within Israeli society are very slim.
Thank you, Tom. Really, thanks so much for your answer. I mean, it has been a quite complex question, and for sure we could have discussed it the next 2 to 3 to 4 hours or so. I think you do see the different questions raised in the Q&A.
I do now. Okay.
Okay, fine. So let me summarize some of them. I think let's start back to the very broad picture you brought to us, starting with Theodor Herzl, to today's situation. A very critical question. Thank you for your presentation, Tom. According to it, Herzl and Rhodes a vital context to understand Israeli society and the current war, but neither the Holocaust, without which there might not even be an Israeli state today, nor October the 7th, without which there'd be no war in Gaza right now, are even worth mentioning.
Okay, so I can't really claim to cover everything in Israeli and Zionist history within half an hour, unfortunately. But what I try to do is to focus on the structural, as I said. Structural elements are the elements which repeat themselves all through the way over the last century. The Holocaust created one thing that happened as a result of the Holocaust was it created stronger Western support for the establishment of the State of Israel to be like a refuge for Jewish refugees in Europe. That was one of the considerations when the UN approved of the partition. But the infrastructure for there being a Zionist state was already there, and the infrastructure was built up over previous decades through all the processes that I mentioned. So I'm not going into exactly what were the conditions which enabled it to be set up exactly in 1948. That of course, there's many different conditions, but the structural elements from then until now are continuous. And the fact that it is a settler colonial society, it is a settler colonial society, even the fact that there was a Holocaust doesn't change the fact that it is a settler colonial society. It is a condition specific to that settler colonial society. But the fact that Israelis control more land is not a result of the Holocaust. The fact that Jewish Israelis have more access to land is not a result of the Holocaust. It's a result of the history that I mentioned. And October 7th was a result of all this process, this very long process of people being displaced, people resisting, Israel using its military to displace them and resist even more, and so on and so on and so on. And I could really go into from 1967 to now to all the different turning points and the limitations. The limitations they were in Gaza, all the blockade for the last decade. I didn't mention at all the shortage of water and electricity and access to hospitals and so on and so on and so on. But I deliberately didn't try to say the specific situation in Gaza and Israel, but to look at two overall concepts which I think have influenced all our history in the last century.
Thank you. Thank you. I think quite clear answer to the overall issue of how to include and why you didn't include the Holocaust in your presentation. Let me switch to another question. I'm very sorry that you can't read it. I thought you could.
No, I can. You told me, now I can.
Okay. Shall I bring up another question or some more questions? To what extent can Israeli citizenship be shaped in a non-Zionist way? Or to put it another way, can a non-Zionist Israeli self-identity be formed through or within the State of Israel? Or must the State of Israel inevitably be Zionist and thus necessarily practice a state of permanent war with the Palestinian population?
So I mentioned at the end, when I talked about decolonization, I mentioned the Haifa Future Vision document, which were prepared by scholars who are affiliated with the representative body of Palestinian citizens of Israel, and they imagine a future of Jews and Palestinians living together in Israel, but without privileges for Jews. So imagining like cultural autonomy, which would be equal for Hebrew speakers and Arabic speakers. A college which respects the religious days of Jews, Muslims, Christians, and Druze, for example. So instead of privileging Jewish holidays, which is something that non-Jews suffer very much from. If you're a Christian student in an Israeli university, you won't be able to go home for Christmas. You have an exam on Christmas. You could have an exam on Christmas, for example. So we can imagine if you follow these suggestions, you can imagine it being reformulated in a more egalitarian way. Whether you call it the state of Israel, or whether you call it the state of, Israelstein or something like that, I don't think it's not so important. But you can imagine the same population living under different institutional arrangements. So I don't think it's necessary we would even upon more. I think I can imagine a situation where, and people have suggested, the Palestinians have suggested, not just Jews, situations where we can live together in a more institutional equality, which is more recognized, as opposed to now when we have more privileges.
Thank you for that. Some more questions from here, from the classroom. Yes, maybe let's try, if you raise your voice. Tom, I don't know if you can hear our colleague. Let's see, let's try.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. It was super interesting. My question would be, do you think the international community should have a role or responsibility in the decolonization process? And if yes, how so?
Helmut, can you repeat that? I didn't hear.
Yeah, maybe it's better really to come here. This, I'm very sorry for that. This is the standard of technical equipment here at the University of Vienna. It's about the international community and how it can support a process of decolonizing Israeli society. But yes, please.
I'm just going to say, do you think the international community should have a role or responsibility in the decolonization process? And if yes, how so? And also if it would be possible to outline the current political forces, parties, and what are their goals, just for better context. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay, current political forces and role in decolonization. Okay, so I want to answer the role of decolonization question first. Yes, I think if you take the JNF, the Jewish National Fund, it is considered a charity in a lot of countries. I don't know what the situation is in Austria, but the countries, I think in the US, for example, it's considered a charity. People can donate to the JNF as if they're doing, good deeds, while the JNF are busy displacing, for example, Bedouins in the Nakab, in the Negev, in the south of Israel. They're driving people out of their land to establish Jewish-only localities instead. So yes, the international community could step in and say, we boycott the JNF. We won't give any money to the JNF. We certainly won't give tax donations or things like that to the JNF. And in a more general sense, Israel is not China. We're not, a huge, gigantic world. It's very difficult. China also practices settler colonialism in Xinjiang, and in Tibet, especially in Tibet, I should say. But it's very difficult to boycott China because, obviously they're a huge economic force. It's difficult to imagine the world economy being separating itself from China. Israel is not China. It's a much smaller country, and it will be much more outside pressure on Israel in all sorts of ways, economically, academically, on sports, on anything like that, would be felt much more. And that could help limit, the more people are aware, the more there isn't impunity, the more people are aware of the possibility of external intervention, the more they can protect the rights of Palestinians, because that is a counterweight. That is something which the government, it's not even decolonization, it's just, to stop them actually doing the current genocide, or to stop them harming the rights of Palestinians in some way. The more there is external pressure, the more I think that is likely to succeed. The Israelis by themselves, the Israeli left by itself is not likely to succeed. Current political forces. So the Netanyahu's party is called the Likud. They've been in power on and off since 1977. They're a very sort of mainstream political party. They're less popular since October 7th. He probably won't get elected because even his base was hit very hard, like physically hit very hard, harmed very hard by what happened on October 7th. And the country is in a huge mess. A lot of people being displaced. There's an economic crisis. So for all those reasons, of course, he's seen as responsible in a lot of ways. So, but currently is the prime minister. You have what are called the center-left parties, which the main difference is they respect the rule of the separation between the government and the high court. They don't want the government to overreach. They want the high court to remain independent. As I said, that is important economically. It's important in terms of minority rights. Also, the professionals are likely to support that. They want the rule of law and so on. And they're headed by generals, right? So they're not separate, as I said, militarism. They're not separate. They're not going to criticize the army. On the other side, you have the extreme right-wing parties. The Ben-Gvir and Smotrich are two ministers in the government who are the most extreme right-wing people we've ever had. Ben-Gvir is a disciple of Kahana, who was the a Jewish fascist who was thrown out of the Knesset at the time. It was considered so extreme that they banned him from running in the elections in the late 1980s. And now he's a minister in the government, and he is, openly genocidal. And they are saying, they've said explicitly, we'll bring the government down if the war ends. So they're quite openly saying we want to continue the war, and that is that's what we're invested in. And they talk in very openly sort of genocidal terms. And so those are the main political forces. The former, there's the Labour and Meretz sort of cooperate with the center-left parties, and they're very weak, and they're unlikely to pass the threshold. At least one of them won't pass the threshold in the next parliamentary elections. And then we have the Arab-led parties. We have Hadash, the Jabha, which is the ex-communist party, and we have a Muslim, sort of conservative Muslim party, which are sort of the Arab-led parties, and they, of course, are more critical, especially Hadash and Jabha, the left-wing parties are a bit more critical of the current situation. They refused, for example, Netanyahu sent around a petition to say he doesn't want to be put on trial by in The Hague. There's now a threat of him putting on trial. Every single party in the Knesset signed that, apart from the two Arab-led parties and the Labour Party, who thankfully managed to show a little bit more principle in this case. But apart from them, every single, and they're only, I think, 4 members of the Knesset, but apart from that, more than 100 members of the Knesset out of 120, from one side to the other, all said, hands off Netanyahu. Don't touch Netanyahu. We don't want him to be put on trial, and this is, anti-Semitic and so on and so on.
Thank you. Thanks really so much. Do we have some more questions here from the classroom? Yeah, please. Another one. And then I think we will switch again to our audience and the Q&A section.
Thank you. I think I saw my question also in the chat. So it is quite personal. I was wondering if you researching and lecturing about this topic have faced any kind of obstacles or repressions on this, as I know scholars in Austria here face quite some repression, especially using terms like decolonization, Nakba. So yes, I was wondering.
Yeah, I think I have. I mean, I don't want to center myself, but since you asked, when I was in Berkeley, I had a lecturer I wanted to work with, and she was great. I was a research assistant, and I was a teaching assistant, and she's a world-famous scholar in the area. I heard of her for a long time before that when I was in Israel, so I was very excited to work with her. And I set up times to go to office hours, and I wrote a research proposal, and I mentioned, some of her work, and I was prepared to have a discussion of, and my subject, as you know, is the as Helmut told you, it's about settler colonists and debates about ethnic cleansing. So I go into her office hours, and I quoted her, so I'm prepared to say, you quoted me right, you quoted me wrong, and then she says, well, it says the Palestinians were expelled. Why did they say they were expelled? So I said, well, that was the thing. But she said, wouldn't you say some of them fled? So I said, yeah, okay, but they fled. But why did they flee? They fled under threat of being killed, and it's part of the same process. So she said, wouldn't you prefer to say fled? So I said, no, I would not prefer to say fled. And we left it at that. And I couldn't work with her. I had to work with a lecturer who was more leftist, but also was a very bad supervisor. He didn't answer any of my emails. I couldn't publish much for my PhD afterwards because I kept getting the same answers from when I sent to journals. They said there are similar questions. Why are you saying this? Why are you saying that? Why aren't you mentioning blah, 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 blah? And I just got, I could have done. I need more patience, but every time I got revised and missed with some kind of stupid question, I just thought, forget you. And within Israel, I won't tell you where I work, but I won't tell you where I work. I don't want to tell you where I work because that could be threatening. But I have friends who have similar views to me, who have been fired, Palestinian and Jewish friends, who have been suspended, who have been told by their college. A friend of mine signed a petition about, he said Biden needs to intervene or something like that, and he's been suspended from his college. A Palestinian friend who teaches in Hebrew University has had death threats. because she went on some kind of she was interviewed and she said what is going on is a genocide. She said that several months ago, and since then you know, the university has tried to suspend her, and she said the university leaders said that this is a Zionist institution, you shouldn't talk that way. So you know, Palestinian students are facing crazy restrictions. They're being thrown out of their dorms. They've been almost lynched. They post very innocuous things and then they get misinterpreted and they get suspended without any due process. And so, yeah, it's not so easy having more critical opinions. Not so easy for Jews and even less easy for Palestinian citizens.
Yeah. Thank you, Tom. Thanks really so much for your clear answer. Let me bring in some of the questions raised in the Q&A section, and I think you referred once in your talk at the end when talking about decolonizing Israeli society, about the necessity to put pressure from outside, economically, politically. And one of the questions in the Q&A is, how do you think the Israeli society would react to potential sanctions or any economic boycott from the West? So this refers to reactions. I think we can see in the future as well. As you know, there are already different kinds of discussions on the necessity of boycotting given the situation today in Gaza. But what do you think, how the Israeli society as well as the political institutions would react on that kind of policy?
On the level of rhetoric, at least in the short term, of course, people are going to say this is anti-Semitic, and the usual, you know, we know the responses, just as, you know, every single limitation is always, there's always this sort of outrage, and how can you say that about us, and we are the victims, and so on and so forth. But I can tell you that these things can be effective. The threat of the threat of academic boycott, for instance, for a decade, the higher institution, the higher education institution, which is supposed to accept universities, to approve of universities, did not approve of Ariel University. Ariel University is a university in the West Bank. And the reasoning they gave was, if we do this, we will face sanctions. And in the end, the government had to bypass them and set up a special alternative body only for the West Bank in order to approve of this as a university. And in the end, they managed to get it bypassed. But these people were very, very frightened, and not because of, you know, because they're such radical leftists. These are very establishment figures. The heads of universities are never very sort of radical activists. But they thought, if we do this, we will face pressure. Therefore, this is a negative incentive. We want to approve of Ariel University. So when people face a negative incentive, when they think, if we do something that is going to problematize our projects and things we're trying to advance, they react. They're pragmatic. They're not all completely crazy. So, I mean, take into account, yes, of course, you will hear lots of rhetoric about, you know, criticism, any kind of criticism of Israel is anti-Semitic. But I think people will react pragmatically in to some extent. And of course, the more pressure, the more reaction. People want, you know, economic. Israel, as I said, is not China. You know, it's not an independent country with huge amount of resources where it can allow itself to sort of cut itself off from the rest of the world. Or even Russia. You know, Russia has allowed itself sustain a lot of sanctions and still continuing. But Israel is not some kind of economic superpower. So people will be affected, and people care very much about their economic, you know, well-being, and that could be, in my view, that could be effective. Yes.
Mm-hmm. Thanks really for the answer. On the other side of the coin, who will be the ones who will be able, or who intend to sanction Israeli capital, Israeli economy? And for sure, this is a question about not only the states here in the European Union and the West in general, but that is for sure also a question about the social movement, the solidarity movement here, demanding exactly these issues. Mm-hmm. From your point of view and your experiences you have from the US, what is your analysis? What is your perspective on the social solidarity movement here in Western countries, in very general terms, Western Europe, on campuses, as well as in the US?
Well, I can talk more about the US because I lived in the US. I've never, I visited Vienna once, and Helmut hosted me, and it was beautiful. But apart from those few days in Vienna, I really know very little about Austrian society, so I don't want to pretend I know anything. But in the US, really, the student movement has been very, very important. Even if we only have a few universities who have actually said they would divest their investments in companies, not even in Israeli companies, but in companies which are invested in the occupation. It could be US companies in the occupation. Mostly are. But the fact that you have a movement, the fact that it's talked about, the fact that there is, when you have BDS discussions in universities, you have hearings. And when you have hearings, you have students who've never heard these voices before, Palestinian students saying, this is what it's like to live under occupation. This is what it's like not to have access to clean water. And I have friends who have been transformed by that, who didn't hear, Jewish friends, for example, in the US, who grew up in a very sheltered, but not only Jews, but let's take Jews who come from a very sort of Zionist background. And people have told me, I'll give an example of Simone Zimmerman, who went to UC Berkeley. She came there as a very sort of strong sort of Zionist and saying, any criticism. She cried in the divestment hearings because she didn't want to hear so much criticism of Israel and so on. And today, you should see the film Israelism, because that portrays that's been going around campuses in the US and in Europe, and that portrays that trajectory. And today, she's a very, very strong advocate of Palestinian rights because she was exposed to more of these things. So that really is, to me, that is the real importance. I don't think the campus movement alone is going to have a huge economic impact. And even according to research, even in the case of South Africa wasn't deeply influenced just specifically by, a couple of universities pulling investment here and there during the 1980s. But the student movement, the fact that you had all these people talking all the time in the news about what South Africa was doing, that in the end went on to continue to churches, to labor unions, to I remember there was a documentary about South Africa, and there was the manager of Barclays Bank who was investing in South Africa. And he said one day his daughter wanted to get a check cashed in the local grocer, and they refused the check. And at that moment, he realized it was over. He said, if the grocer can't cash our checks because of the anti-apartheid movement, they've won. So I think raising awareness and pushing back against all this incitement says, wanting Jews and Palestinians to have equal rights in this country is anti-Semitic. I mean that is nonsense. Of course, any movement in the world can also be anti-Semitic. I mean, there can be anti-Semitic elements, just like can be racist or sexist or homophobic elements in any movement. But the basic demand that people have equal rights is not anti-Semitic, and we really need to. And I admire your efforts in university, as you described at the beginning, Helmut. But I think it's very, especially in German-speaking countries, because of the history, there's a very strong tendency to sort of make up for what's happened by scapegoating Palestinians. As if Palestinians should pay the price for what European nations did to Jews. What is it, 70 years ago or 80 years ago? But no, there's no reason why a single child should die in Gaza because of something that happened in Europe in the 1940s.
Yeah, thank you really so much for your absolutely clear answer to that. And I think we will see how the solidarity movement will grow, will differentiate different ideas, readapt to different methods of protest in the near future. Is there any more question? My students, I'm asking the classroom now. Some last one, because it is already 8 o'clock here in Vienna, 9 o'clock in Tel Aviv. So Tom, really thanks so much for still answering in such an eloquent way the different questions. So I think we don't have any more questions here. I think we have no new ones in the Q&A section. So Tom, it's 8 o'clock here, 9 o'clock in Tel Aviv. Thank you really so much for this very impressive and wonderful talk. And thanks for giving us food for thought.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. All the best and take care.
Okay, so see you.
Thank you.
Good luck with your work.
Thank you.